It's late July 2026, and the Strait of Hormuz just went quiet again. And when that stretch of water goes quiet, it never means peace. It means something is about to blow. Iran redeclared the strait closed just days ago, and Tehran's own military sources confirmed it out loud. But here's the twist. The United States and CENTCOM are flatly disputing that claim, saying nobody gets to unilaterally shut down 1/5 of the world's oil supply just because they feel like flexing again. So you've got two completely different stories being told at the same time. Iran saying the strait is theirs to open and close like a toll booth, and Washington saying that's cute, but no. And while that argument was happening on paper, it was happening for real out on the water too, because shipping data from just the last week showed only 3 commercial vessels crossed the entire strait in a full 24-hour period. 3. That's the lowest number recorded since May. To put that in perspective, before this conflict ever started, this stretch of water used to see somewhere close to 90 vessels a day moving through it without a second thought. Now you've got tankers sitting dead in the water in the Gulf of Oman, engines idling, captains waiting on word from insurers, waiting on word from governments, waiting on word from anybody who can tell them whether the next mile forward gets them hit. And then the United States military did exactly what it's done for going on 13 consecutive nights now, which is show up and remind everybody who actually controls that airspace. So let's talk about what actually happened, because the sequence here matters. Iran spent the last several weeks trying to rebuild something it lost back in the spring, and that's control over the narrative in the strait. Back in May, Iran stood up something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a government body out of Tehran that tried to convince the entire shipping world it needed to email a Tehran address, hand over its crew manifests, its cargo details, its insurance paperwork, and then pay a toll, sometimes reportedly as high as $2 million a ship, just to be allowed safe passage through international waters that Iran does not own. JP Morgan actually ran the numbers on that scheme and said if Iran had been allowed to keep collecting those tolls unchecked, it could have pulled in something like $70 to $90 billion a year. That's not a toll booth, that's a hijacking with a spreadsheet attached. And for a little while, some ships actually played along, because moving cargo is moving cargo, and insurers will pay almost anything to keep the boats moving. But then the attacks started again, ships getting struck with drones, ships getting hit with cruise missiles, and that toll booth fantasy fell apart in about the time it takes a missile to cross open water. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Iran didn't just quietly go back to blocking the strait, they went back to it loudly, and they tied a whole list of conditions to it, ceasefire demands, references to other conflicts entirely unrelated to the Gulf, basically using the world's most important energy choke point as a hostage negotiation chip. And every single time they've tried that play this year, the response from Washington has been the same, more strikes, not fewer. CENTCOM has been running nightly operations for going on 2 weeks straight at this point, hitting Iranian missile and drone storage sites, coastal surveillance positions, air defense assets, and naval capabilities up and down that southern coastline. Officials have confirmed CENTCOM completed its 12th consecutive night of strikes just a couple days before this, and by the time you're watching this, that number's probably already climbed higher. And this isn't scattered, random bombing either. This is systematic. Night after night, the target list keeps widening. First it was missile storage, then it was radar, then it moved into command and control infrastructure, and now you're looking at strikes hitting basically the entire operational backbone that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps needs to keep threatening that waterway in the first place. So let's rewind a little further, because the ship attacks that triggered this most recent wave didn't come out of nowhere. Multiple commercial vessels were hit in the days leading up to this, some by drones, some reportedly by cruise missiles, and among the confirmed strikes were tankers that were specifically using the internationally recognized safe corridor, the route that was negotiated so commercial shipping could avoid exactly this kind of harassment. That detail matters a lot, because it tells you the intent wasn't defensive, it was a message. Hitting a ship on the safe corridor isn't a mistake, it's Iran telling the world there is no safe corridor unless Tehran says so. The International Maritime Organization has already tallied more than 50 shipping incidents tied to this conflict, and at least 17 seafarers confirmed dead or missing since it began, and that number has been ticking up basically every single week. These aren't military personnel who signed up to be in a war zone. These are merchant sailors, guys hauling fuel oil and liquefied gas and grain, guys just trying to do a job that used to be considered one of the safer, more boring jobs in global trade. Now it might be one of the most dangerous. And President Trump's response to all of this was about as blunt as it gets. He posted that from that point forward, anytime Iran fires on a ship in the strait, whether it's a missile, a drone, a rocket, or anything else, the United States will respond by destroying an Iranian bridge or power plant. Think about that for a second. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's a direct line drawn from maritime attacks straight to Iran's domestic infrastructure. And on top of that, there was a genuinely wild financial move that came out of this too. $2 billion in frozen Iranian funds that had been sitting with the United States is now being redirected straight to the commercial shipping companies whose vessels were destroyed by the IRGC. So Iran's own frozen money is now literally being used to pay off the very companies Iran attacked. That's not just a punishment, that's poetic in a pretty savage way. You attacked commerce, so now your own money funds the recovery from the attack you launched. It's also worth understanding how that Persian Gulf Strait Authority scheme actually worked while it was still functioning, because it tells you a lot about how deliberate this whole strategy was. Vessels looking to transit had to email a specific Iranian government address, hand over more than 40 separate pieces of information, ownership structure, insurance provider, full crew nationality breakdown, cargo manifest, previous vessel names, basically a complete dossier on the ship and everyone aboard it, all before Tehran would even consider issuing a permit. And Iran was careful about how it framed the money-changing hands too, insisting publicly that these weren't tolls, they were fees for coordinating safe passage, a technicality that matters because international law generally prohibits charging tolls through natural straits like Hormuz, even when the strait runs through a country's territorial waters. So Iran built an entire bureaucratic front specifically to dodge that legal distinction, dressing up extortion as a service fee. And for a couple of months earlier this year, it actually worked well enough that the authority reported processing of more than 300 transit requests, mostly outbound tankers headed to China and India, the two buyers who've been the most willing to keep doing business with Tehran, no matter how radioactive that relationship looks to everyone else. But the entire arrangement only ever worked as long as ships believed paying the fee actually bought them safety. And the moment that stopped being true, the moment tankers that had paid up were getting hit anyway, the whole scheme lost its only real selling point. Nobody pays protection money to someone who can't actually guarantee protection. And that's exactly the trust that collapsed here. Now let's talk quotes, because Tehran's rhetoric machine never really slows down, no matter how badly the week is going for them on the ground. Iran's foreign minister went on record recently describing his country's entire doctrine in 3 words: an eye for an eye. Shocking. Truly groundbreaking diplomacy there. But here's what's actually notable. The response that came back from Washington wasn't matching that energy, it was raising it. Secretary of State Rubio put out a line that basically rewrote the whole rulebook, saying that whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American response costs more, and it doesn't scale down to match. In plain English, that's the Secretary of State telling Tehran the old tit-for-tat era is over, and from here on out, every strike gets an answer that's bigger, not equal. That's a pretty significant shift in doctrine to just casually drop into a press appearance, but that's exactly what happened. And then you've got Iran's own military wing making threats that honestly might be the most self-defeating move of the entire conflict. Because the IRGC specifically named a Royal Air Force base in the UK as a legitimate target, the same base that's been running B-1 bomber operations into the region. Naming a NATO-adjacent air base as a target is not the kind of thing that gets you sympathy from the rest of the world. It's the kind of thing that gets you a formal terrorism designation, which is exactly what the UK slapped on Iran and the IRGC as a direct result. So in the span of about a week, Iran went from trying to quietly extract shipping tolls to threatening a European airbase and getting formally blacklisted by a G7 nation. That's not exactly a winning sequence of decisions, but it does tell you something important, which is that the people making these calls inside Iran right now are not thinking 3 moves ahead. They're reacting, and reacting badly. Before we go further, if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, drop a like on this one and subscribe if you haven't, because this story is moving fast, and there's a lot more happening on the ground and in the water than most coverage is actually explaining clearly. Also, drop a comment with what you think happens next, because the range of outcomes here is genuinely wide open right now, and it's worth hearing what people think is coming. So let's actually get into the hardware, because this is where the story gets technical and honestly pretty fascinating. The backbone of these nightly strikes has been a mix of F-35s, F-16s configured specifically for what's called Wild Weasel work, and naval assets running cruise missile strikes from offshore. The F-16CJ variant is built around a system that hunts enemy radar the moment it powers on, passively listening for the signature of a surface-to-air missile system trying to light up a target, and then handing that location straight to a harm missile before the operator on the other end even knows he's been found. That's the entire suppression of enemy air defense doctrine in one sentence. Find the radar, kill the radar, and open a clean lane for everything flying behind it. And what's flying behind it lately has been getting a lot heavier. There's been a substantial buildup of B-2 Spirit and B-1 bomber activity, flying long transatlantic legs out of bases in the US and the UK, refueling across a chain of tankers stacked over Europe like a bridge in the sky, all pointed toward the Gulf. That kind of movement doesn't happen for routine patrols. Getting a bomber wing, a Wild Weasel squadron, and every support unit that fuels and arms them into theater. takes weeks of coordinated logistics, not a single phone call. And when you see that scale of buildup happening in real time, it's a pretty clear signal that whatever comes next is being built to be bigger than what's already happened. And that brings us to the one target that keeps coming up over and over in official statements. A heavily fortified underground site that officials have described as basically the last major hardened facility still standing after months of strikes. The weapon built specifically to deal with a target like that is the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster designed to punch through layers of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating deep underground where surface strikes simply can't reach. It's been described by officials as being primed and ready, essentially just waiting on a decision at the highest level. And alongside that, the standard bunker buster being used on coastal missile storage and IRGC command sites has been the 5,000-pound class weapon, which explains a lot of the secondary explosions you've seen reported after these strikes. Because when a bomb that size hits a facility storing rocket propellant and stockpiled munitions, you don't get one explosion, you get a chain reaction. Munitions cooking off one after another as the fire spreads through connected storage tunnels. That's the signature officials have pointed to repeatedly this month. And it tells you these sites weren't just command buildings, they were active ammunition and missile depots hidden inside hillsides specifically to avoid exactly this kind of strike. And it's not working the way Iran hoped it would. And the blockade enforcement piece deserves its own attention, because it's easy to picture a blockade as some abstract line on a map, but this one is actively physical. CENTCOM has been redirecting commercial vessels, attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports, and in cases where ships try to run it anyway, disabling them outright. Officials have confirmed dozens of vessels intercepted and redirected since the blockade was reimposed, with a handful physically disabled after refusing to comply. That's the Navy version of suppression of enemy air defenses, except instead of radar sites, it's tankers. And instead of missiles, it's boarding parties and disabling fire aimed at engines and rudders rather than hulls. The goal isn't to sink commerce, it's to make absolutely certain nothing tied to Iranian state revenue moves through that water without American forces knowing about it first. And that's a very different kind of pressure than airstrikes, because airstrikes make headlines. But a sustained blockade is the kind of pressure that just quietly compounds in the background every single day. Invisible until you look at the revenue numbers and realize an entire national economy has been slowly starved of its main export for months on end. Now here's the honesty check, because it's important not to oversell this. Iran is degraded, but Iran is not disarmed. The International Institute for Strategic Studies estimates Iran still fields somewhere around 570,000 active duty troops with another 350,000 reservists behind them. And even after months of strikes, Iranian forces have shown they can still generate multi-front missile and drone attacks reaching as far as Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan in a single night. That's not a force that's been erased. That's a force that's been badly hurt and pushed into a defensive crouch, which is a very different thing. The IRGC is also extremely good at one specific skill, which is dispersal and concealment, hiding missile launchers and drone stockpiles across hundreds of separate locations, specifically so that no single strike, no matter how big, can wipe out the whole arsenal at once. So while the headline numbers on nights of continuous bombing sound massive, and they are, the reality on the ground is a grinding war of attrition, strike after strike, night after night, slowly working through a target list that was deliberately built to be too large and too scattered to finish quickly. Let's shift over to the economic side for a second, because this fight isn't just being fought with missiles, it's being fought with money. And honestly, the financial pressure might be doing more damage to the regime than the bombs are. The blockade the U.S. reimposed on Iranian ports has been estimated to be costing Iran somewhere around $500 million a day. Read that number again, $500 million a day, every single day this drags on. Oil prices have been moving on every twist of this story too, with Brent crude sitting in the high 90s per barrel and swinging on every piece of news out of the region, traders weighing actual military escalation against tentative signs of diplomacy, and none of them fully trusting either signal for very long. Oman has been quietly working as a mediator behind the scenes, trying to get some kind of transit framework in place that both sides could actually live with. And there have been separate talks in Doha aimed at a broader agreement, but every time it looks like something might be close, another ship gets hit and the whole conversation resets back to zero. And that's really the pattern that's defined this entire year. An agreement gets floated, shipping starts to cautiously pick back up, and then within days something breaks it, sometimes an attack. Sometimes just Iran attaching new conditions that have nothing to do with the strait itself, like tying reopening to unrelated conflicts happening elsewhere in the region. It's a pattern of using the world's oil supply as leverage for completely separate political fights, and it's a pattern that's burned through Iran's credibility with mediators pretty badly at this point, because you can only cry wolf on a ceasefire so many times before Oman, before Qatar, before Egypt. before anybody stops taking the next promise seriously. Now, let's get into the roundup of everything else happening around this story, because there's a lot moving at once here. Saudi Arabia has been ramping up its own operations against Houthi rebel positions in Yemen, striking facilities the Houthis have been operating out of. And that matters because the Houthis are widely understood to be an Iranian-aligned proxy force. And there have been direct threats out of Yemen recently to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well, which is the other major choke point ships used to route around the Arabian Peninsula whenever Hormuz gets shut down. So you've essentially got Iran and its proxies trying to squeeze traffic from both directions at once, Hormuz on one side and Bab el-Mandeb on the other, and the U.S. response to that has been direct, with officials warning that America will hold Iran accountable for any future Houthi attack on shipping, treating the proxy and the patron as one and the same when it comes to consequences. Meanwhile, there's also been a UAE decision to actively join strike operations against targets inside Iran, which is a significant escalation from a Gulf state that's historically tried to stay a little more measured in its public posture. And it signals that patience across the wider region for Iran's harassment campaign has basically run out. Back in Washington, there's a political fight happening that's just as important as anything happening over the water. Because Congress recently approved something like $95 billion specifically earmarked to fund this conflict, which tells you the appetite in the administration and in a majority of Congress is to keep pushing, not pull back. At the same time, a war powers resolution aimed at pulling U.S. forces out of this conflict actually passed the House by a narrow margin, 214 to 208, but it died in the Senate 49 to 47, close enough to show there's real political division over how long this should continue, but not close enough to actually change anything. That vote was largely symbolic anyway, since the executive branch has shown zero indication it's listening to it, but it's worth noting because it tells you the American public and American lawmakers are not unified on this, even as the military campaign keeps intensifying night after night. There's also a human cost to this that's worth pausing on before moving to what comes next, because it's easy to get lost in troop numbers and hardware specs and forget that every night of strikes and every night of Iranian retaliation carries real casualties on both sides. American service members have been killed in this conflict, their names read publicly, their flag-draped transfer cases met on the tarmac, families standing at attention for people who won't be coming home. And on the other side, reports have suggested tens of thousands of Iranian protesters have been killed by their own government over the course of this year, a number that's reportedly slowed somewhat as the regime's attention has shifted toward the external fight, but hasn't stopped entirely. That's the piece that gets lost when the story turns into a scoreboard of strike counts and bomb tonnage. There are actual families on every side of this absorbing real loss, and that context matters just as much as the tactical picture, even if it doesn't fit neatly into a headline. More than 50,000 American service members remain deployed across the region right now, spread across ships, air bases, and forward positions, all of it representing an enormous logistical and financial commitment that has to be sustained for as long as this drags on, which is part of why that $95 billion funding package from Congress matters so much. Because operations at this scale simply do not run on goodwill. They run on fuel, munitions, maintenance, and payroll, all of which adds up fast when you're sustaining nightly combat operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. If you're finding this useful, now's a good moment to hit subscribe, because between the ceasefire talk, the troop buildup, and the economic pressure campaign, this story has about 6 different threads that could all break in completely different directions over the next few weeks, and it's worth having this kind of full picture rather than just catching whatever headline happens to trend for a day. So let's get into where this actually goes from here, because that's really the question everyone's asking. Iran's strategy this entire year has essentially been to try to outlast American political will, betting that domestic pressure, war fatigue, and the sheer cost of sustained operations would eventually force some kind of concession, some kind of off-ramp that lets the regime survive intact. Historically, that's not actually a crazy bet for a regime to make. Plenty of long conflicts have ended exactly that way, with the more determined or more patient side simply outlasting the other's appetite for continued fighting. But the math looks different this time for a few specific reasons. First, the financial bleed is enormous and it's compounding daily. $500 million a day doesn't just hurt, it accelerates internal pressure, because that's money that isn't propping up subsidies, isn't paying salaries, isn't keeping basic services running for population that's already been through waves of economic pain this year. Second, the political fracture inside the regime itself appears to be widening, with reports of hardline clerics publicly criticizing earlier ceasefire agreements as a betrayal, and with state broadcasts reportedly being cut off mid-statement when officials try to explain concessions to the public. When you see internal state media literally cutting off its own officials, That's not a sign of a unified leadership calmly managing a crisis. That's a sign of a regime arguing with itself in real time about which direction to go. And then there's the third piece, which is the sheer scale of military buildup currently flowing into the theater. When you see B-2 and B-1 bomber activity increasing, when you see additional Wild Weasel squadrons moving in, when you see tanker aircraft stacking up across Europe specifically to support a bridge of heavier aircraft into the Gulf, that's not the posture of a campaign that's winding down. That's the posture of a campaign building towards something larger. Whether that larger action ends up being the strike on that last major hardened facility, or whether it ends up being enough pressure to finally force Tehran back to a real negotiating table instead of a stalling one, that's the open question right now. And honestly, nobody outside a very small circle actually knows the answer yet. There's also a piece of this that doesn't get talked about enough, which is what happens to the rest of the world's energy markets while all of this plays out. A fifth of global oil trade and a fifth of global liquefied natural gas trade moving through one narrow channel means that every country on Earth that isn't directly involved in this conflict is still feeling it, whether that's through higher fuel prices, shipping insurance premiums that have climbed into territory nobody's seen in decades, or entire trade routes getting rerouted around the southern tip of Africa just to avoid the region altogether, adding weeks to delivery times and real cost to everything from gasoline to plastics to the fertilizer that ends up in food supply chains halfway around the world. Countries that have nothing to do with this fight, that never fired a shot and never had a ship anywhere near the Gulf, are still paying a quiet tax on it through their own economies. And that's part of why there's been so much diplomatic pressure from outside the immediate region to get this resolved, because the collateral economic damage doesn't respect borders the way missiles do. And that outside pressure is exactly why Oman, Qatar, and Egypt have kept trying to insert themselves as mediators, even after getting burned by broken promises multiple times already this year. Each of these countries has its own reasons for wanting this resolved quickly. Oman shares a maritime border with the Strait itself and has the most direct stake in keeping it functional. Qatar exports its own liquefied natural gas through nearby waters and can't afford a permanently destabilized Gulf. And Egypt watches Suez Canal revenue and regional shipping patterns closely enough to know that a long war here eventually reshapes trade flows in ways that hurt everyone in the neighborhood, not just the two countries actually fighting. So even though these mediation efforts keep collapsing within days of getting announced, they keep getting relaunched because the incentive to end this hasn't gone away. It's just been repeatedly overridden by the incentive on Tehran's side to keep extracting concessions before actually committing to anything durable. What we do know is the pattern that's repeated over and over this year rarely favors a quiet resolution. Every ceasefire attempt so far has cracked within days. Every toll scheme Iran has tried to stand up has collapsed. The moment shipping companies realized paying it doesn't actually guarantee safety. And every escalation from Tehran has been met with a proportionally larger response from Washington, rather than a smaller one, which is precisely the opposite of what a regime trying to negotiate from strength would want to see happen. If the current trajectory holds, expect the nightly strike campaign to keep climbing in both frequency and scale, expect the blockade to keep squeezing Iran's revenue day after day, and expect more regional players, not fewer, to keep sliding into direct or indirect involvement, because a war that started as a bilateral conflict has slowly pulled in Gulf states, European air bases, and proxy forces across two separate maritime choke points at the same time. It's also worth remembering that this isn't the first time this year the Strait has technically reopened only to slam shut again within days, and each cycle has followed a familiar rhythm: cautious optimism, a handful of tankers testing the waters, and then a single attack that resets the entire calculation for every shipping company watching from the sidelines. Insurance underwriters have been tracking this pattern closely too, and war risk premiums for vessels transiting the wider Gulf region have climbed to levels that make certain routes barely profitable even when the Strait is technically open. Which means the economic damage here isn't just about whether ships can physically pass through, it's about whether it makes financial sense for them to try at all. That's a distinction worth sitting with, because even a diplomatic breakthrough tomorrow wouldn't instantly undo months of accumulated distrust from an industry that's watched promise after promise collapse within days. The bigger picture here really comes down to this: the Strait of Hormuz was never just a strip of water. It's the pressure valve for roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil trade and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas. And whoever controls the ability to open or shut that valve effectively holds leverage over the global economy itself. Iran has spent this entire year trying to prove it can hold that leverage through toll schemes, through selective attacks, through loud declarations of closure timed for maximum media attention. And the United States, along with a growing coalition of regional partners, has spent this entire year proving the opposite, that no single actor gets to unilaterally choke off global trade without paying an escalating price for every single attempt. Neither side has fully won that argument yet, But the trend line over the past several weeks has been pretty clearly moving in one direction. More pressure, more strikes, more financial bleeding for Tehran, and less patience from Washington for another round of promises that don't hold. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Does this end with Iran finally coming to a table it actually intends to honor, worn down by the daily cost of keeping this fight going? Or does this keep climbing toward that final hardened target and something even bigger than what we've already seen? Both paths are still on the table right now, and which one wins out probably gets decided over the next few weeks, not months. Let us know what you think happens next down in the comments. Whether you think the economic pressure eventually forces a real deal, or whether you think this keeps escalating towards something much larger. Because the range of educated guesses on this one is genuinely wide right now. And if you want to stay ahead of how this develops, go ahead and subscribe and share this with anyone who's been trying to make sense of what's actually happening in the Gulf right now. Because between the shipping data, the military buildup, and the political maneuvering in Washington, this is one of those stories where the headlines alone really don't tell you the full picture. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.